Well, hello. Welcome to one of our last Zoom sessions in anatomy. Actually, we got a few more weeks to go, but we are now looking at Unit 7, Retrocochlear Pathology. We'll spend a couple of weeks on this as well, and then we'll probably follow it up with a review of lots of stuff that we've covered. We're a little bit ahead of time in anatomy, which is fine by me. I'd rather be ahead of time than behind the time. So what we're looking at is the first of a couple of Zoom sessions in retrocochlear pathology. So retrocochlear just means behind the cochlea, retro, and it includes the 8th nerve and the brain stem and the temporal lobes of the brain. And when you get into looking at retrocochlear pathology, that's when you start looking at nerves, not so much hair cells, but we start getting into what we call nerves. So without any further ado, why don't I share screen and share with you the notes and the PowerPoint to do with this particular unit. Anyway, the weirdest thing is, yesterday, I couldn't get onto Zoom. I couldn't get Zoom to record for love nor money. So here's a small hope and a prayer that things will actually include the audio. You might have gotten my email to the effect that the audio wasn't working yesterday. Well, here's hoping we got that fixed. I recorded 110 acoustics, and that seems to have worked out well. And I've uploaded that onto Unit 5 in 110 acoustics. So here's 120 anatomy, and we're into retrocochlear pathology. I believe it's Unit 7. I'm not 100% sure. I get mixed up. I think it is, though. I think Unit 6 was inner ear physiology and stuff like that, and Unit 5 was inner ear anatomy. So this would be Unit 7, I believe, retrocochlear pathology. So share screen, and yep, I look at the bottom left of the screen and I see a little green microphone moving up and down, so that does tell me we are recording. So here goes. Share screen, and let's look at notes. Here we are, 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system, C-A-N-S, CANS. Read Lassen Woodford chapter 4, pages 93 to 107. Have a look at your Martin text. I'm no longer sure if chapter 12 is it, because Martin comes out with a new edition every couple of years, and that changes like the wind. So, but you can certainly find it in your table of contents at the front of the book. 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system. Let's define some things here. Look at your notes right here. CNS, central nervous system. That includes your brain and your spinal cord. So really your brain can be considered to be in your head, but it also has a tail, which goes all the way down your backbone to your rear end. Okay? Your spinal cord and brain are the central nervous system. Every other nerve in your body is the peripheral nervous system. So the 8th nerve, even though it's in the head, the pairs of 8th cranial nerves are in the head, they are not part of the central nervous system because they're not the brain and they're not the spinal cord. You see the logic there? PNS, peripheral nervous system, is all other nerves, spinal nerves, cranial nerves, smaller nerves, yet tertiary nerves. So spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. You got like 31 pairs of those. Cranial nerves come off the brainstem. Think of the brainstem as the spinal cord inside your skull. So you have 31 pairs of nerves coming off of the spinal cord, and once you enter into the skull, you have 12 more pairs, only these now are called cranial nerves. And in our field, we look at 3 of these pairs, the 8th pair, the 7th pair, and the 5th pair. And we both know that the 5th and the 7th pairs are involved in the acoustic reflex arc. Okay, just to highlight what that is again, outer ear to middle ear to cochlea, wait a second, inner hair cells of the cochlea, which are in contact with the 8th nerve. That's the afferent or brain-going portion. That contacts the brain stem, and then from the brain stem, we have efferent nerves going back out, the 7th pair and the 5th pair. And the seventh pair is called the facial nerve, and it ends on the stapedius muscle. And the fifth pair is called the trigeminal nerve, and it terminates, one of its branches terminates on the tensor tympani muscle of the middle ear. Acoustic reflex arc covers quite a bit of territory. Outer, middle, inner ear, eighth nerve, and even part of the brain stem. Wow. Okay. The spinal cord on our notes here is actually then part of the brain. The brain can be considered to have a long tail. Many neural messages go along nerves to spinal cord and then right back out again. They never reach the brain. They never reach the cortex. And these are called reflexes. Like if you have your legs crossed and the doctor taps the knee with a hammer and your foot sticks out. Reflex. Like when you touch a hot stove and your hand instantly recoils. That message to instantly pull your hand back never meets your brain. That message went up your arm to your brain, to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord gave a reflex to your arm to instantly pull back. Reflex. Acoustic reflex. Never reaches your cortex either. What's the acoustic reflex arc we just said? Outer ear, middle ear, inner ear, eighth nerve, brain stem, and then back out again. And remember, the brain stem is just the spinal cord inside your skull. But the top of your brain, you never thought, I think I want to pull those two muscles in my middle ear. It was beyond your control. It's a reflex. Neural messages that actually go all the way to the brain, read down here in our notes. Reactions involving conscious thought and awareness, that's different. Those things are taking place in the brain. For example, the first time you ever tried tying a shoe. Take the bunny rabbit and bend the shoelaces and pull it through. You had to think. But after a while, as an adult, you're just going, like when you're trying to find your way to your friend's house for the first time. You're carefully looking at the street signs and carefully, your whole brain's involved. After a while, when you get used to it, you're hardly thinking about it anymore. It's almost all reactions. It's just kind of memorized patterns. You're just kind of do-do-do-do-do. So after a while, you get used to things and you develop a pattern. And when this happens, then the activity that you had such a hard time or that the whole brain was lit up thinking about, later on, your whole brain is no longer lit up thinking about it. It's more the brain stem and the more primitive areas. It's like the task of tying your shoes or finding your way to your friend's house gets relegated to a more primitive part of your brain. Okay, so always think about things like that. It's a we'll go to the PowerPoints here and take a look, see what we've got. And the reason I'm doing this is to categorize these four things here. Typical neuron, building blocks of the nervous system. Let's look at a picture. Typical neuron. Now, neuron, whoops, make it larger here. Neuron is one fiber of a nerve. The eighth nerve has 30,000 fibers, just like a rope, has many, many fibers in it, okay? So fibers, one particular neuron fiber typically will look at the pieces and parts of it. You have a nucleus, the cell body, with lots of little arms. Those are called dendrites. And there's the cell body that feeds the neuron. That's the brain of it, so to speak. And then you have a long arm like this called an axon. And the axon ends in these little buttons, synaptic buttons. And they talk to the next neuron, which is going to touch these guys. Okay? This one here is multipolar, meaning it has many arms. A long arm here and many small ones here. Neuron fibers that look like this are called multipolar, and these are usually efferent motor neurons. In other words, they come from the brain, from the spinal cord, to the muscles. And that's what efferent motor neurons do. They control muscles and glands. Okay? Afferent neurons don't have that kind of a shape. They are bipolar. We'll show you one of those later. So categorization, oh yeah, back to this picture here. Look at these hot dog buns. See the hot dog buns along the axon? Those are white matter. They're fatty layers of lipid, L-I-P-I-D. They are fatty layers. In a way, they kind of act like the rubber around an electrical wire. They insulate the wire. So you can think of the axon as being the copper wire of your electrical cord, and you can think of these buttons here, I should say these white hot dog buns here, think of those as the rubber around your electrical cord. And if you don't have that rubber around your electrical cords may touch each other and you'll get a short. So these are white matter, and they line the axons, just like hot dog buns. The messages down the neuron go like this: boom, to bump, to bump, to this, to this, to this, to this, and out. If you don't have that lipid, that fatty white insulation, you get multiple sclerosis. That's what MS is. Your neurons are losing the ability to send messages to the muscles. When you're categorizing neurons, you have to always think about gray matter and white matter. So gray matter is the cell body. It's unmyelinated. See, the hot dog buns, the lipid, the white matter is called myelin. M-Y-E-L-I-N, myelin. White matter is myelin that coats or covers the axon arms of the neuron, and gray matter is the cell body. It's not covered with white. So now let's look at our 4 boxes here. You'll see 4 terms: nerves, tracts, ganglia, nuclei. Nerves are bundles of white axons in the peripheral nervous system. So the 8th nerve would fit here. Okay? It's not the brain, it's not the spinal cord, and you got 30,000 myelin or fibers that are myelinated, and they're white matter. And the gray matter of the 8th nerve is the spiral ganglia, because that's in the cochlea and that's not myelinated. Those are gray matter. Okay? In the central nervous system, the spinal cord and the brain, bundles of white axons are called tracts. Tracts. So, white matter in the central nervous system is the white myelinated axons called tracts. In the peripheral nervous system, the same thing is called nerves. Now let's look at gray matter. So now you've got bundles of gray cell bodies, ganglia, spiral ganglia in the cochlea. And in the brain stem, because now you're in the central nervous system, in the brain stem, bundles of cell bodies of neurons are called nuclei. So you've got several pairs of nuclei in the brain stem. So 4 different categories: nerves, tracts, ganglia, nuclei. Nerves and tracts are white matter, ganglia and nuclei are gray matter. Nerves and tracts are the long axon arms, and ganglia and nuclei are groups of cell bodies. Very good. Here's 2 neurons talking to each other. So here's a cell body, here's an axon, and it ends in those little buttons, kind of the buttons that you saw here. See these guys here? So when they end as what they call a synapse. And the synapse has a tiny little cleft. They're not touching the other neuron. It sends messages right out from that little bulb there. And then these dendrites pick up the neurotransmitters. I'll show you a picture of it closer up. Here's the end of one of those buttons. And here's the neurotransmitters waiting to be sent across. Look at that. They burst open and across the synaptic cleft to the next neuron. So they don't ever actually touch each other. When you get various diseases like Parkinson's disease, you've lost some neurotransmitters. So the nerves aren't talking to each other very well. Parkinson's disease. So let's go back up here. And now you're looking at 2 different kinds of neuron fibers. On the left, you're looking at multipolar, and on the right, you're looking at bipolar. Now, we said earlier, multipolar are motor neurons. They're attached, they go from the central nervous system or whatever, and they go to muscles. And they make you contract your fingers or raise your arms or run, move your legs, move your tongue, move your lips, okay? These are multipolar, one cell body, many arms, a long axon, maybe with a few different arms, multipolar. On the right, you're looking at what's a neuron fiber of the 8th nerve attached to an inner hair cell. There's a little synapse there, and you have a cell body, one axon, and another axon. Okay, so bipolar means a cell body with 2 axons. Multipolar means a cell body with 1 or more axons and lots of different dendrites. So that's the difference. And here's another picture of them. Multipolar on the top would be a motor neuron. Bipolar is like the 8th nerve. Bipolar neurons are sensory. Vision nerves are bipolar. Taste nerves are bipolar. Touch, bipolar. Anything that goes to the brain. Sensory information, bipolar. Motor information back out, multipolar. And this is just a weird one. Good. Let's look at our brain stem. Now you're looking at the bottom of the brain here, and you're looking up. Okay, so this would be the front of the brain, the sides of the brain, and the back of the brain, and you're looking at its underside. It's like your head is back, and you're looking at the underside. These here deal with, I believe, smell. Interesting. Anyway, here's your brain stem. And here's your brain stem. And this white area near this big area here, that's the cerebellum. C-E-R-E-B-E-L-L-U-M, cerebellum. That just means little brain. And the cerebellum doesn't help you think. The cerebellum is mostly for fine motor control, fine muscle control, so that you can thread a needle. So you can do fine things. If you have cerebellum disorders, you're often not walking very well. You're staggering. Some people with cerebellar disorders are picked up for being drunk, and they're not. Okay, so cerebellum, brain stem, and look at the pairs of nerves coming off. Cranial nerves. And look at the Roman numerals here. 12 of them. 12 pairs. Roman numerals are neat. 1, 2, 3, IV 4, V5, VI 6, VII 7, VIII 8, IX 9, you know, then 10, XI 11, and then XII 12. Cool, huh? And the 8th pair, this one right here, follow the cursor, ends right here. So if I put on my glasses even to see better, where does the 8th nerve end? It ends right here. See the top of the brain stem here, and then this big area here? This is called the medulla of the brain stem. M-E-D-U-L-L-A, medulla. Medulla. It's the bottom of your brain stem. This big area here is called the pons. P-O-N-S, pons, French word for bridge. Medulla, I think, is the Greek word for marrow. Anyway, and this is the top of the brain stem, called the midbrain. Midbrain, pons, medulla. Medulla, pons, midbrain. And where does the 8th nerve end? At the junction of the pons and the medulla. You'll hear more about that next week. Look at the 7th facial nerve. Ends kind of really close to the same place, doesn't it? And look at the 5th cranial nerve. I can't even see where that goes. I believe that's this one here, but I can't even see it. Anyway, how many pairs of cranial nerves do you have? 12. Now we're descending outside of the skull, and here's your spinal cord. And your spinal cord has 31 pairs of nerves. Spinal nerves, 31 pairs. Cranial nerves, 12 pairs. Look at the 8th nerve. It's a bipolar nerve. Each one of these neurons has a cell body. Each one of these neurons has a long axon going to the brain stem, and then a rather short axon going to the hair cells. So actually, if you were thinking about the 8th nerve being bipolar, Okay, if you're thinking about the eighth nerve being bipolar, you could think about my head being the cell body, one arm sticking out, an axon going to the brain stem, and a really short arm sticking out going this way to the inner hair cells. Because the spiral ganglia are in the cochlea. They're just outside the scala media. So one axon of the eighth nerve is really short, and the other axon is much longer. How long is the eighth nerve? 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters. About the length of the cochlea if you unrolled it. Okay? Very short. How big is the brain stem? About like your pinky. A little over 1 inch long. About the same thickness. Okay? Brain stem, eighth nerve. Eighth nerve is the shortest of all of your cranial nerves. All of your other cranial nerves are longer. The eighth nerve is the shortest one. The eighth nerve is purely a sensory nerve. It's bipolar. All it does is take info to send to the brain regarding the cochlea and balance organs. Other cranial nerves are not only just sensory. Some cranial nerves are motor. The seventh facial nerve moves your cheeks. Okay? And it also innervates the stapedius muscle. The fifth cranial nerve is partly sensory. If someone slapped your face, the feeling you get is from the fifth cranial nerve, but it also has a bit of a motor portion. It also has a bit of a multipolar nerve because it controls, one of the things that it does is it controls the tensor tympani muscle. So some cranial nerves are both afferent and efferent. They have a sensory and a motor portion, but the eighth cranial nerve is purely sensory. Share screen again and look at our notes. Let's pull out of here. Notes. We want the notes. Okay, so here we go. We're moving down. We've covered these areas. Myelin, white fatty sheath that lines a neuron fiber, allows electrical transmission along the axons and dendrites. Gray matter is unmyelinated neuron cell bodies. Bundles of white myelinated neuron fibers in the PNS, peripheral nervous system, are nerves. In the central nervous system, these are tracts. For example, eighth nerve is a bundle of myelinated neuron fibers in the PNS, and the term corticospinal tract. You can even piece that together now. Cortex, spine. If you have a long tract, long piece of white matter connecting the brain to the spinal cord, corticospinal tract is a bundle of myelinated fibers in the CNS. Groups of unmyelinated gray areas, neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system are ganglia. In the central nervous system, these same things are called nuclei. For example, the term spiral ganglia is unmyelinated neuron cell bodies in the cochlea, that is, in the peripheral nervous system. The term cochlear nucleus, however, or even that we covered just a dash in acoustics one time, I mentioned it, superior olivary complexes. That's what helps you localize the direction of sound. I said they were a pair of nuclei inside your brain stem. We'll be talking about those more next week. Those are nuclei too. They're groups of cell bodies in the central nervous system this time. The eighth nerve is bipolar. Sensory afferent neurons go to the central nervous system. Smell, vision, hearing. They are relatively few in number, found only in mammals. Motor neurons are multipolar. They are efferent because they return from the central nervous system back out to muscles or glands. There are more of them. And then we have millions and trillions of tiny little interneurons, especially in the brain. Very short little neurons that talk to smaller little areas that connect smaller areas. And these serve to integrate sensory experience and organize muscular behavior at the brain level. So now that we've learned some lingo and some language about neurology, Okay, then we can start talking about the eighth nerve. Let's see what other pictures we might have, though, that deal with what we've talked about so far. You saw this guy here. We'll move to here. This is a similar picture to this one. Okay, what are you looking at here? Again, scala media of the cochlea. And look at this very closely. Do you see these little bumps? Bumpity, 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 bump. Those are the spiral ganglias. So one short little axon goes from the spiral ganglia to the inner hair cells inside the scala media. And the other axon is much longer and goes to the brain stem. And remember, this is just showing you the membranous labyrinth. That's why I wrote this in here, membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth is taken away. Okay, here you can see the balance organs, the utricle and saccule, the three semicircular canals, and they also have neuron portions that go along the eighth nerve. So there's the vestibular area of the eighth nerve and the auditory area of the eighth nerve. And they all go through a tunnel of bone right here to the brain stem, and it's called the internal auditory meatus. Internal auditory meatus. The external auditory meatus is your ear canal. The internal auditory meatus is the tunnel through bone through which your eighth nerve travels from the cochlea to the brain stem. Here's a picture of spinal ganglion close up. So here you're looking at a bunch of them. So what we're doing is we'll just pull up and look at one. And there's the unmyelinated gray cell bodies of each neuron fiber. And each one of these cell bodies has a neuron fiber that goes to the inner hair cells and a neuron fiber that goes to the brain stem. One axon here, one axon here. Bipolar. Spiral ganglion, nerve cell bodies of the cochlear nerve, or eighth nerve. These are tuning curves that we talked about in acoustics this morning. Okay, and here you can see how the eighth nerve indeed is tonotopic. Specific frequencies are represented in specific places. Just like you can say the highs are located at the base of the cochlea, the lows are located at the apex of the cochlea. Look at how the fibers leaving the apex are wrapped deep inside the eighth nerve, and the fibers representing the high frequencies are located on the outside of the eighth nerve. So tuning curves show you that the eighth nerve is tonotopic. Let's pick one of these fibers. Pick this one right here. Perhaps its tuning curve might be this. If this is frequency, and this is the softest it takes in order to make that neuron fiber fire, you can see that that one particular fiber likes this frequency because fewest decibels are required to get it to fire and send a message to the brain. So it has a favorite firing frequency. You can say that that one fiber is tuned to this frequency. And this fiber is tuned to this frequency. And this fiber is tuned to this one. And this fiber is tuned to this one. Lower frequency, higher frequency, and so on and so on. And I showed you in acoustics this morning a typical tuning curve showing once again the characteristic frequency, showing you that one particular neuron fiber from the eighth nerve, one of its 30,000 fibers, will have a favorite frequency. In other words, the fewest decibels are required to make that particular fiber fire and send a message to the brain. And if I try to make that neuron fiber fire with a lower frequency, I have to make the sound much louder. And if I try to make that fiber fire with a higher frequency, I have to make it much louder. And then when you've got sensory neural hearing loss, because you've lost the sharpness of the traveling wave, because you've lost that love and feeling, you've lost the point on your traveling wave, you lost your frequency resolution. You can't distinguish between frequencies as well anymore, especially ones that are close together. Now your traveling wave peaks are more dull and rounded, and your tuning curves are also more rounded. Notice two things here with the red one. First, more decibels are required to get that particular fiber to fire. But secondly, other frequencies surrounding the frequency in question can also pretty well get that neuron fiber to fire. So the loss of frequency resolution taking place because of the outer hair cell damage, which makes an active traveling wave into a passive traveling wave, that damage is reflected further up the system as well into the eighth nerve. This is boring. So now we're going to be talking about eighth nerve tumors. But let's just kind of focus where we are in our notes. Let's see right where we are to make sure we're all still there. I also want to make sure that, yep, we're still recording because I'm looking at the little microphone. The green thing is still dancing there. You can tell I'm kind of paranoid from yesterday. Anyway, so eighth nerve. Anatomy and physiology of the eighth nerve. From spiral ganglia, it goes through the internal auditory meatus to the brain stem. It is the shortest cranial nerve. It meets the brain stem at a nucleus called the cochlear nucleus. That's the bottom-most central auditory nervous system nuclei. It's the bottom-most auditory area of the central nervous system. So what's the first pair of nuclei in the brainstem? The cochlear nucleus. Okay, that's where it meets. And where's the cochlear nucleus located? At the pontomedullary junction. Eighth nerve is tonotopic with a neuron axons that are twisted like a rope. Fibers from the cochlea apex are wrapped deep inside. Fibers from the base are more wrapped on the outside. And interestingly, the nerve is bipolar, but its axons are actually unmyelinated inside the cochlea. So the one short arm that goes from the spiral ganglia to the inner hair cells, that's unmyelinated. But the other arm, the longer arm that goes from the spiral ganglia to the brain stem, to the cochlear nucleus of the brain stem, that's myelinated. You have 30,000 afferent eighth nerve fibers, and they come from 3,000 inner hair cells. So each inner hair cell is innervated by 10 eighth nerve fibers. Basically, 10 fibers per inner hair cell. The cell bodies of the eighth nerve are located in the spiral ganglia. Now, what innervates the outer hair cells? The outer hair cells, it's a separate nerve, and it goes along the eighth nerve, but in the opposite direction. Okay, it goes from the brain to the outer hair cells. It's an efferent motor nerve to make the outer hair cells stretch and shrink, to make the outer hair cells amplify and sharpen the traveling wave. Okay, and that's called the olivocochlear bundle. It goes from the brain stem back to the cochlea. And what part of the brain stem? A pair of nuclei called the superior olivary complexes, SOCs. They are the second highest. In other words, they're just above the cochlear nucleus. So you have a cochlear nucleus. I'll show you here. I'll stop sharing. You'll have a brain stem. Maybe I'll just draw it for you. It's more fun, just so I can show it to you easier. Okay? So here's your brain stem. See if I can show that to you. There you go. And then I'll draw a cochlea. Pair of cochleas. Eighth nerve. And then it hits the cochlear nuclei. And then above the cochlear nuclei, you got a couple of nuclei inside, and these are called the superior olivary complexes. Superior olivary complexes. Okay? And those are a little bit higher up. And what happens is you've got info going up this way, but also this way, and up this way, and also this way. You get information going from side to side. It goes up and up to this one, but also across and across. So this paranuclei, the superior olivary complexes, are the first nuclei to get information from both ears. And that's why they are involved in directional hearing. They are the ones that are comparing the time of arrival of the sound, the timing differences, and also the tiny intensity differences between the ears. So if someone's talking to me from over here, their voice is going to hit this ear a split second before it hits this one, and the voice is going to be a tish louder here than it will be here. And the superior olivary complexes are comparing the time of arrival and the intensity differences between the ears. And that's what tells you which direction the sound's coming from. Cool, huh? So it's not like this ear hears from there and this ear hears from there. It's more beautiful than that. It's more wondrous than that. And I guess that's what I'm trying to convey here. Okay. So now so this SOC, the superior olivocochlear bundles, the superior olives also are involved in this particular nerve. Okay? They send info to the outer hair cells, and their cell bodies are located at the superior olivary complexes. And those nerves go to the outer hair cells. And how many outer hair cells do you have? 12,000. But how many olivocochlear fibers do you have? Only 1,800. So 1,800 fibers have to share 12,000 outer hair cells, whereas 30,000 eighth nerve fibers talk to 3,000 inner hair cells. So you can see that the innervation patterns are way different. All right, carrying on, just giving you some stuff here. We'll talk about this next week as well, of course, but we're just kind of getting through, taking a look here. Eighth nerve tuning curves, we said, show that the eighth nerve is tonotopic. Nerves all fire at some spontaneous rate, even when they're not stimulated. It shows that they're alive, but the neural threshold shows how much sound is required to increase this rate of firing, and that's what's shown by the tuning curves. Each of the 30,000 eighth nerve fibers has its own particular tuning curves. Tuning curves are done on animals. The sound is put into an ear. The firing rate in exposed eighth nerve fibers is carefully measured. And the object is to find the decibel level required across the different frequencies to get that neuron fiber to increase its firing rate. So without any further ado, let's look at it again. Eighth nerve, tuning curves. Okay, this fiber, or this fiber, or this fiber, this one, or this one. The tuning curves show at what frequency, follow my cursor, the fewest decibels are required to get that neuron fiber to increase its firing rate. Okay, all neuron fibers are firing because they're alive, but what's going to suddenly make them increase? And that's what I'm showing here too. I'm picking one tuning curve and I'm bringing it closer, saying, okay, we can see that at one particular frequency, the fewest decibels are required to make that neuron fiber fire. If I try to make it fire with other frequencies, more decibels are required. Tuning curves. I'm just going to scroll through here, see what we've got. I just want to take a look at this. Oh, yeah, this is all good. Okay, so let's take a picture of an eighth nerve tumor. Here's an eighth nerve tumor. Growing on here's the internal auditory meatus. Here's the cochlea. Auditory portion of the eighth nerve, vestibular portion of the eighth nerve, and there's the tumor. Looking at it here, now you're looking at the bottom of the brain again. And now the tumor has escaped outside of the internal auditory meatus, because the internal auditory meatus is a tunnel of bone and it's got no give. The tumor will grow along it until it can get out and into the soft area of the brain stem. And now look at the size of it. And see how it's squeezing the 7th nerve and the 8th pair? They're squeezed, and the whole brain stem is bent. Okay? Interestingly, in the brainstem, gray matter is on the inside, white matter is on the outside. When you get to the brain, it's just the opposite. Gray matter is on the outside, and white matter is on the inside. But this is a huge tumor that's got to be taken out. Here's a cross section of the internal auditory meatus. There's the tunnel of bone. There's the 7th facial nerve, vestibular portion of the 8th nerve, auditory portion of the 8th nerve, and you can see that the lower frequencies are deeper inside and the higher frequencies are more toward the outside. 6,000 hertz would be here, 1,000 hertz is deeper inside. Here's just a more of a schematic drawing. Facial nerve, vestibular portions of the 8th nerve, auditory portion of the 8th nerve tumor. This is called the ABR, auditory brainstem response. It's a non-behavioral test of 8th nerve tumors. Now, audiologists are trained to do this. The HIS is not, but you should know what it is. Okay, just like you should know what an ENG is, electronystagmography, testing the balance areas, okay? You should know what these initials mean. Whenever you see the term ABR, think auditory brainstem response. It's got 2 purposes. One is to estimate thresholds. What they do with the auditory brainstem response is they put one electrode on the earlobe, another electrode on this earlobe, another electrode right at the hairline, and a 4th electrode to serve as a ground right between the eyes. Then they put headphones on you. And in the right ear, they'll deliver sounds. And they'll see if they get brain waves. And if they get brain waves, they look like here. And it's got 5 peaks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when the sound is put in nice and loud, you got all 5 of those waves. When you make the sound in the ears softer, the waves start to fade out and they seem to delay a little bit. See how that one's a little bit later? And they make the sound 40 and the earlier waves disappear and just peak 5 remains. And then they make the sounds even softer and only peak 5 remains and it's even later, but you can still see it. Look, they did it 2 or 3 times and it's still there. That means the baby has good hearing. This is the way they test infants. This is the way they test mentally disabled people who can't tell you what they hear. And it also tells you if the person's lying. It's a good way to test a malingerer. Okay? Left ear, same thing. Normal, you got a peak 5 all the way down to 20 dB, meaning the person's got pretty normal hearing. But another reason for doing ABR is to detect 8th nerve tumors. So this person might have had a left 8th nerve tumor. Look at the ABR in the right ear. 80, nice waves. 60, nice waves, a little bit delayed. 30, you can still see a peak 5. Look at the left ear. And the left ear didn't even have to have much hearing loss. Maybe the left ear only had like a 20 decibel hearing loss due to the tumor. Okay? Remember, asymmetrical sensory neural loss. Asymmetrical. 8th nerve tumors only grow on one ear. They don't grow on both. Okay? When a person gets sensory neural hearing loss in one ear, that's weird. Okay? That's a red flag to refer to a physician. Could be an 8th nerve tumor. Again, 8th nerve tumors are rare. They only occur in about 1 in 100,000 people. They are rare, but they are fatal. It's a benign tumor that will infiltrate the brain. You saw earlier in the picture. So here they presented it at 90 dB. And look at how the ABR is longer. And what parts are affected here? Well, 3 to 5 That's not so much different than the distance from 3 to 5 is here. What's making this wave look weirder is the 1 to 3 interval. This 1 to 3 is much longer than this 1 to 3. Let me just say this. The first half of your ABR is your eighth nerve. The second half of your ABR is your brain stem. So if the 3 to 5 interval was what's making things longer, you'd say you have a brain stem tumor. If the 1 to 3 portion is what makes the wave longer, it's the eighth nerve tumor. And look at this, they made it now 80 dB, and it's just about gone. 70, it's gone. So that's eighth nerve tumor. Okay, weird. And this is a story about an eighth nerve tumor. And I'll read this to you, and then that's the way we'll finish today's Zoom session. Okay, I'll just read it to you. An acoustic neuroma, eighth nerve tumor, caught our family completely by surprise despite the slow progression of the symptoms and an equally slow diagnostic process. In 1992, my wife Linda began to experience equilibrium problems and loss of hearing in her left ear. Excuse me. The family doctor speculated it might be an inner ear problem and suggests she reduce her salt and caffeine intake. He referred her to a specialist for an ABR. They called it a Bayer test. We call it ABR. The test, which typically should have detected the tumor, was inconclusive. Within a few weeks, the symptoms subsided, and we assumed that the salt and coffee had been the cause. 2 years later, Linda began to notice a loss of sensation in her teeth, gums, and tongue. Her doctor suggested that she check with a dentist who referred her to an oral surgeon. The process took several weeks of appointments, referrals, tests, and follow-ups. In the end, they were unable to determine the cause of her symptoms. Linda was finally referred to an ear, nose, and throat specialist who sent her for a CAT scan. It revealed a 3-centimeter tumor growing from her auditory canal, internal auditory meatus, inward along the auditory nerve. We were stunned by the diagnosis. Linda, our 2 teenage daughters, and I were looking for a simple explanation, a dental problem, a change in diet, a minor inner ear concern. Instead, we learned that an acoustic neuroma is a serious condition requiring major surgery and long-term after effects. A neurologist told us more about her acoustic neuroma, and we obtained information and support from the Acoustic Neuroma Association of Canada. Yeah, I happen to be in Canada. Anyway, an acoustic neuroma is a benign tumor that grows around the nerve sheath from the inner ear through an opening in the skull, internal auditory meatus, toward the brain stem. The tumor grows slowly. You can tell it's Canada because they have a U in the word tumor. Grows slowly, putting pressure on the nerves in the opening and eventually on the brain stem itself. As the nerve sheath is compressed, it causes deafness, loss of facial sensation, tinnitus, ringing in the ears. If left untreated, it can kill you. Statistically, 1 in 100,000 people have it. Treatment options include surgical removal, which is the most common. 3 different surgical approaches are common depending on the size and location. The most common, the translabyrinthine, trans being across, labyrinth being cochlea. Kill the cochlea, drill right through it, and get the 8th nerve out. You'll be deaf in that ear for the rest of your life. Okay, resulted in a total loss of hearing in the affected ear. Since Linda's tumor was relatively big, this was the recommended procedure. The operation lasted 9 hours, during which an ENT and a neurosurgeon cut through her skull behind her left ear to gain access to the tumor. Once the tumor was in sight, they separated the tumor from the nerve sheath, carefully removing it piece by piece. In her case, during the last stages of the procedure, after they removed most of the tumor, a blood vessel started to bleed. The doctors later told us they had to cauterize this blood vessel to avoid the possibility of a stroke. The result, as we were soon to learn, was partial facial paralysis due to traumatization of the 7th nerve. The question was it permanent or temporary? She struggled with intense headaches, poor balance, lack of energy. As these problems began to subside, she had a great deal to learn about loss of hearing in her left ear. She also lost a significant amount of control of the left side of her face and eye. She worked diligently to get over the paralysis. I mean, imagine all of this stuff. I'll let you read this stuff on your own, but imagine, imagine a woman with a face like this. And now that's just how you are when you're going to the grocery store. Imagine. They sometimes do surgery for that, and they will link a glossal, a nerve from the tongue. They'll somehow link it up with the damaged seventh facial nerve, so that when the person puts her tongue behind her front teeth, this turns to this. As long as the tongue is put behind the front teeth, the face will be normal. So at least Linda, when she goes to the grocery store or out, as long as she's doing that, the face will be okay. But it's not like that in all cases, but it's just to tell you, it's nasty stuff, okay? That's why unilateral sensory neural loss is a red flag. It could be due to excess noise on that side. It could be due to another thing on that side, but a case history helps to rule that out, and so does a good hearing test. You'll learn lots more about this next year in audiometry. When you start taking audiometry, you'll learn way more about all this, but this is your first foray in 120 anatomy about eighth nerve pathology. Anyway, we'll continue on where we were from today, next week, and I hope to begin this one on Tuesday at the regular time instead of Wednesday in the evening. All right, sayonara, I'll stop recording now.